January 17, 1943, North Atlantic, 52 degrees north, 30 degrees west. The U-boat commander pressed his eye against the periscope lens, salt spray obscuring his view for a moment before the horizon cleared. Through the gray Atlantic waters, another silhouette emerged, a cargo ship fat with supplies, riding low in the water. He'd seen 3 already this week. The steel hull bore the unmistakable profile of American construction, boxy and utilitarian, lacking the graceful lines of European merchantmen. His crew waited in silence, condensation dripping from the pressure hull above their heads, the smell of diesel and unwashed bodies filling their nostrils. The commander called out the bearing and distance. Torpedoes armed. This would be the 4th Allied vessel sent to the bottom in as many days. Another small victory in the endless arithmetic of Atlantic warfare. What Kapitän Leutnant Klaus Bargstein could not have known, hunched in that cramped conning tower with seawater soaking through his leather jacket, was that the ship he was about to destroy had been replaced before it even sank. Somewhere across the ocean, in a place called Richmond, California, another identical hull had already slid down the ways that very morning, and another would follow tomorrow, and the day after that. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by a single engagement or a brilliant tactical maneuver. It was won in the shipyards. It was won by welders and riveters, by crane operators and steel workers, by an industrial mobilization so vast and so rapid that it defied every calculation the German Kriegsmarine had made. The Liberty ship program represented something the Third Reich fundamentally misunderstood about American industrial capacity, not merely the ability to produce, but the ability to produce at a scale and speed that transformed quantity into an insurmountable strategic advantage. When German naval planners sat in their Berlin offices calculating tonnage ratios and replacement rates, they were working from a European framework, from experiences drawn from the Great War, from an understanding of shipbuilding that belonged to another era entirely. They knew that Britain had built ships during the First World War. They knew about production targets and construction times. What they did not know, what they could not conceive, was that American shipyards would soon be launching a complete 10,000-ton cargo vessel every single day. The mathematics of naval warfare had always been brutal and simple. Sink more tonnage than your enemy can replace, and you strangle their supply lines. Admiral Karl Dönitz understood this calculation intimately. His Wolfpack tactics had sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the ocean floor. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank over 6 million gross register tons of Allied vessels. The numbers seemed overwhelming, decisive even. Dönitz calculated that if his submarines could sink 700,000 tons per month consistently, Britain would be forced to sue for peace within a year. The mathematics appeared sound. Historical precedent suggested that no nation could sustain such losses. But Dönitz was calculating based on traditional shipbuilding paradigms, on construction methods that had remained essentially unchanged since the age of riveted hulls and hand-fitted plates. He was fighting a 20th century war with 19th century assumptions about industrial capacity. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of calculation was taking place. In September 1940, the British Merchant Shipbuilding Mission arrived in the United States with an urgent request. Britain was hemorrhaging ships faster than her yards could replace them. They needed American help, and they needed it immediately. The traditional response would have been to negotiate contracts with established shipyards, to work within existing capacity, to accept the limitations of conventional construction. Instead, a ship designer named William Francis Gibbs and industrialist Henry J. Kaiser proposed something audacious. They would build ships the way Henry Ford built automobiles, assembly line production, prefabricated components, welded construction instead of riveting, and a workforce trained from scratch. The British were skeptical. The American maritime establishment was openly hostile. Kaiser had never built a ship in his life. But the emergency shipbuilding program moved forward anyway, because in 1941, America was learning that survival demanded innovation faster than tradition allowed. The German U-boat crews expected their enemy to be finite. They expected that each ship sunk represented months of construction time lost, skilled labor exhausted, strategic materials depleted. They expected the algebra of attrition to favor them because it always had. U-boat commanders kept meticulous logs, recording every vessel destroyed, calculating the cumulative tonnage, watching the numbers climb toward that theoretical threshold where Allied supply lines would collapse. In the officers' mess of U-552, Lieutenant Top kept a running tally on the bulkhead: ships destroyed, tonnage sent down, crew members lost. Each mark represented what they believed was irreplaceable loss for the Allies. Each sinking was a step closer to victory. They could not imagine that in Richmond, California, in Portland, Oregon, in Baltimore, Maryland, and in 17 other locations across America, shipyards were operating on 18-hour shifts, 6 days a week, with construction times dropping from 224 days to 42 days to an impossible, record-breaking 4 days and 15 hours. The Liberty ship was never meant to be beautiful. It was designed to be functional, producible, and above all, fast to build. Based on a British tramp steamer design, the EC2SC1 type measured 441 feet long with a beam of 57 feet. It could carry 10 to 800 deadweight tons of cargo, tanks, trucks, locomotives, aircraft, ammunition, food, fuel, everything an army needed to fight. The design was deliberately simplified. Compound curves were eliminated wherever possible. Decks were flat. Hull plates were standardized. Everything about the Liberty ship prioritized mass production over elegance. Naval architects who had spent careers mastering the subtle art of ship design found themselves working on what amounted to a floating box. But that box could be built in pieces by workers who had never seen a ship before, assembled in sections, and welded together in a fraction of the time traditional methods required. The transformation of American shipbuilding began with a fundamental reimagining of the construction process. Traditional shipbuilding was a craft. Skilled shipwrights worked from the keel upward, fitting each plate and frame individually, riveting everything together with teams of specialized workers. It was time-consuming, labor-intensive, and required years of apprenticeship to master. Kaiser's approach was revolutionary. The ship would be built in prefabricated sections, entire deckhouses, bow sections, stern assemblies, constructed on land, and then lifted by crane onto the growing hull. Welding replaced riveting, reducing construction time and creating stronger, more flexible hulls. The workforce didn't need decades of experience. They needed weeks of training. Women who had been secretaries became welders. Farmers became pipe fitters. Teachers became electricians. The shipyards drew workers from across the country, building temporary housing, creating daycare centers, establishing cafeterias that served meals around the clock. This was industrial mobilization on a scale America had never attempted. By 1943, 18 American shipyards were producing Liberty ships. The Kaiser Richmond Yard No. 1 became the benchmark for efficiency. In September 1942, to demonstrate what was possible, Kaiser's workforce assembled the SS Robert E. Peary from Keel Lang to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. It was a publicity stunt, but it was a functional, seaworthy vessel that went on to serve throughout the war. The average construction time settled around 42 days. Consider that number. From an empty slipway to a fully functional, loaded, and outbound cargo ship in 6 weeks. The German Admiralty received intelligence reports about American production rates and dismissed them as propaganda. The numbers seemed impossible. They violated everything known about shipbuilding capacity. A nation that had been essentially neutral in 1940 was, by 1943, launching 3 ships per day. The U-boat commanders scanning the Atlantic through their periscopes were not fighting a finite enemy. They were fighting a production line that operated faster than they could reload torpedoes. The symbolic power of the Liberty ship extended beyond its cargo capacity. Each vessel represented something the Axis powers could not replicate. The industrial might of a continent-sized democracy fully mobilized, while German factories struggled with raw material shortages, Allied bombing campaigns, and the logistical complexities of a multi-front war. American shipyards had access to unlimited steel, aluminum, and copper. The United States produced more steel in 1943 than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. That steel became tanks, aircraft, artillery, and Liberty ships, mountains of it. An inexhaustible supply that flowed from mills in Pittsburgh, Gary, and Birmingham, transported by rail networks that dwarfed anything in Europe, shaped by workers earning wages that seemed fantastical to their Axis counterparts. A welder at Kaiser Richmond earned $1.20 per hour, more than many German skilled workers made in a day. That wage differential represented more than money. It represented an economic system that could sustain total war without exhausting its workforce. The German expectation was that attrition would favor them because they were the aggressors, because they held the initiative, because they were fighting on their terms in their chosen arena. U-boat warfare had worked brilliantly in the early years. The happy time of 1940 and 1941 saw Allied shipping losses mount catastrophically. But warfare is not static. Technology evolves, tactics adapt, and most critically, industrial capacity determines who can sustain losses longer. By mid-1943, the calculus had inverted. U-boats were being sunk faster than German shipyards could replace them. Training new crews took longer than America needed to train new welders. The Allies were launching Liberty ships at a rate of 3 per day, while Germany was building approximately 1 U-boat per day. The arithmetic that Dönitz had relied upon was collapsing. For every Liberty ship destroyed, and many were destroyed, 2 more entered service. The U-boat arm was fighting an enemy that grew stronger with each passing month, while their own strength deteriorated through cumulative losses of experienced crews, aging vessels, and increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine warfare. Inside the cramped confines of a Type 7C U-boat, the crew existed in a state of controlled misery. The interior measured barely 20 feet across at its widest point. 50 men lived, ate, slept, and fought in that narrow tube of pressure-welded steel. Torpedoes shared space with bunks. The smell of diesel fuel permeated everything. Fresh food lasted days before the crew subsisted on canned goods and stale bread. Water was rationed. Bathing was impossible. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months. The psychological strain of depth charge attacks, of diving for hours while destroyers hunted overhead, of operating in an environment where a single hull breach meant death for everyone. This was the daily reality of U-boat service. By 1943, the survival rate for U-boat crews had fallen below 50%. New crews arrived at the submarine pens, understanding that their chances of surviving the war were essentially a coin flip. They went anyway, driven by duty, propaganda, and the desperate hope that their sacrifice mattered, that the ships they sank were irreplaceable losses that would eventually bring Britain to her knees. What these young men could not see, staring through periscopes at the convoys passing overhead, was the other side of the equation. They saw the ships they destroyed. They did not see the shipyards. In Portland, Oregon, the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation employed 100,000 workers at its peak. The yard operated 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Welders worked in rain, snow, and darkness, their arc welders casting eerie blue light across the slipways. Women composed a third of the workforce, doing jobs that had been exclusively male a year earlier. Rosie the Riveter was not merely propaganda, she was a statistical reality. The Liberty ships these workers built were not elegant, but they were functional, and more importantly, they were there. When convoy SC-121 lost 12 ships to U-boat attack in March 1943, the loss was grievous, tragic, and ultimately irrelevant to the strategic balance. Those 12 ships were replaced within a week. The crews were irreplaceable, the cargo delays were problematic, but the fundamental arithmetic had shifted. America could afford losses that Germany could not. The cargo that filled Liberty ship holds represented another dimension of American abundance that Axis planners had underestimated. Each vessel carried 10,800 tons of material. Multiply that by 3 ships per day, and the scale becomes staggering. In a single month, American shipyards were adding nearly 1 million tons of cargo capacity to the Allied merchant fleet. That capacity carried Studebaker trucks to the Soviet Union, where they became the primary transport vehicle for the Red Army. It carried M4 Sherman tanks to North Africa, where they equipped entire armored divisions. It carried locomotives to Iran, where they hauled supplies over the Persian corridor to Russia. It carried aviation fuel to Britain, filling the tanks of bombers that would flatten German cities. It carried food, wheat from Kansas, beef from Texas, canned goods from California. The sheer variety and volume of cargo exposed the fundamental economic disparity between the combatants. Germany was operating on ration cards and ersatz substitutes by 1943. German soldiers joked bitterly about Brot auf Strich, literally bread spread, a large substitute that tasted like flavored wax. American soldiers complained about the monotony of their rations while consuming more calories per day than most German civilians. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of an economic system that, for all its flaws and inequalities, had spent the 1930s building industrial capacity on a continental scale. When America entered the war, it did not have to create an industrial base. It already existed, waiting to be converted from civilian production to military production. Automobile factories became tank factories. Refrigerator manufacturers built aircraft engines. Typewriter companies made rifle parts. The conversion was rapid because the underlying infrastructure, the machine tools, the skilled workforce, the raw materials, the transportation networks, was already in place. Germany had built its war economy through coercion and conquest, seizing the resources of occupied territories, enslaving millions to work in its factories. America built its war economy by hiring workers at union wages, by selling war bonds, by rationing consumer goods while maintaining a standard of living that remained, even under wartime restrictions, far above anything available in Axis nations. The Liberty ship became a symbol of this abundance. It was not a particularly good ship in traditional terms. Liberty ships were slow, making about 11 knots maximum speed. They were noisy, with reciprocating steam engines that belonged to an earlier era. In cold North Atlantic waters, welded hulls sometimes developed cracks, and several Liberty ships broke apart in heavy seas. Maritime purists derided them as ugly ducklings and predicted they would be maritime disasters. But they were available. They were produced in numbers that made their individual shortcomings strategically irrelevant. When the SS Richard Montgomery broke in half off the British coast in 1944, still loaded with explosives, it was a tragedy and a hazard that remains to this day. But the loss of one ship did not impact the supply chain. There were 2,110 more Liberty ships in service. This was the mathematics of industrial warfare, not perfection, but overwhelming quantity, backed by the capacity to sustain losses indefinitely. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. May 1943 marked the crisis point. In that single month, 41 U-boats were destroyed. Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that losses had become unsustainable. The wolf pack tactics that had terrorized Allied convoys were no longer viable. Improved radar, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, and code breaking through ultra-intelligence had made U-boat operations suicidal. But even without these technological and tactical advantages, the production differential would have eventually determined the outcome. Germany was building U-boats faster than ever, nearly 30 per month by 1943. But crew training could not keep pace. Experienced commanders were being killed or captured. New crews went to sea with minimal training and were massacred by increasingly sophisticated Allied defenses. Meanwhile, Liberty ships continued rolling down the slipways at an accelerating pace. The Allies were winning a war of industrial attrition, fighting an enemy that had never possessed the industrial capacity to win such a conflict. The German expectation had been rooted in historical precedent. The U-boat campaign of World War I had nearly succeeded in starving Britain into submission. The Admiralty remembered those lean years of 1917 and 1918 when merchant losses approached catastrophic levels. German planners assumed that history would repeat, that Britain's island vulnerability remained unchanged, that severing Atlantic supply lines would produce the same result as before. What they failed to account for was American industrial evolution over the intervening decades. In 1917, American industrial capacity was formidable but not yet fully mobilized. In 1943, that capacity had been transformed by the New Deal's infrastructure investments, by the development of assembly line production techniques across multiple industries, by the integration of technologies that made mass production not just possible, but efficient, on scales previously unimagined. The Liberty ship program represented the culmination of these developments, mass production applied to the most complex civilian product then made. The workers who built these ships came from everywhere and nowhere. They were farmhands displaced by agricultural mechanization. They were Dust Bowl refugees who had fled Oklahoma and Arkansas for California's promise. They were Black Americans fleeing Jim Crow segregation in the South, seeking opportunity in northern and western shipyards. They were women escaping domestic limitation, discovering they could weld, rivet, and operate cranes as competently as any man. The shipyards became crucibles of social change, places where the rigid hierarchies of pre-war America began to break down under the pressure of necessity. A black welder in Richmond earned the same wage as a white welder, performing identical work to identical standards. A woman operating a crane was paid the same as a man. These changes were incomplete, often resisted, and would be partially rolled back after the war. But the experience of mass mobilization demonstrated that social barriers limiting productivity were not natural or inevitable. They were choices that could be unmade when national survival required it. The Liberty ship itself, that ugly duckling of maritime architecture, carried within its welded hull a challenge to authoritarian assumptions about efficiency and production. Nazi ideology held that democratic systems were inherently weak, divided, incapable of the focused will necessary for total war. The Liberty ship program demonstrated the opposite. Democratic capitalism, when fully mobilized, could outproduce authoritarian command economies by orders of magnitude. The shipyard workers were not slaves or conscripts. They were paid employees who could quit, who organized into unions, who negotiated for better wages and conditions. They were motivated by wages, by patriotism, by opportunity, and sometimes by the simple satisfaction of doing difficult work well. This workforce built more shipping tonnage in 4 years than Germany, Japan, and Italy built in their entire industrial histories. They did it while maintaining higher living standards, better working conditions, and greater personal freedom than workers in any Axis nation. The U-boat crews never saw the shipyards. They saw only the results: an endless procession of cargo vessels crossing the Atlantic, convoys that grew larger and better protected, supply lines that no amount of effort could sever. In the cramped quarters of their submarines, German sailors heard the propaganda broadcasts claiming that American industrial reports were exaggerated, that the Allies were on the verge of collapse, that one more push would break the supply chain. They wanted to believe it. They needed to believe it, because the alternative, that they were fighting an enemy with effectively unlimited industrial capacity, was too demoralizing to accept. So they went on patrol, loaded their torpedoes, tracked convoys, and attacked when opportunities arose. Some made it back to base. Most did not. By 1944, the U-boat service had the highest casualty rate of any German military branch. Of roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, approximately 30,000 died. These were not men dying for a winnable cause. They were dying for a strategic objective that had already become mathematically impossible. The transformation of the Atlantic supply line from a vulnerable lifeline to an impregnable conveyor belt of material occurred gradually, then suddenly. In early 1942, U-boats hunted almost unopposed along the American coast, sinking tankers and freighters within sight of shore. By late 1943, U-boat commanders avoided the North Atlantic entirely, seeking easier targets in distant waters where Allied defenses were weaker. The shift was driven by multiple factors: improved Allied anti-submarine tactics, better technology, superior intelligence. But underlying everything was the simple reality that the Allies could replace losses faster than the Kriegsmarine could inflict them. The Liberty ship was the physical manifestation of that reality. Every vessel that slid down the ways at Richmond or Portland or Baltimore was a message to the German Naval Command: you cannot win this war. Your mathematics are wrong. Your assumptions are outdated. Your industrial capacity is insufficient. In the final accounting, American shipyards built 2,610 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945. They also built 414 faster Victory ships, hundreds of tankers, dozens of escort carriers, and thousands of landing craft. The total tonnage launched exceeded 50 million gross tons. Germany sank approximately 15 million tons of Allied shipping during the entire war. The disparity reveals the fundamental imbalance. The Allies were not fighting to maintain parity. They were operating with such overwhelming superiority that losses, however tragic, were absorbed into a system that grew stronger despite them. This was industrial warfare in its purest form, not a battle of tactics or courage or fighting spirit, but a contest of productive capacity where victory belonged to whoever could sustain output longer. The symbolic weight of the Liberty ship extended beyond its military function. It represented a vindication of democratic industrial organization, a proof that free societies could mobilize as effectively as authoritarian regimes. German propaganda had insisted that democracies were too divided, too soft, too selfish to make the sacrifices necessary for total war. The Liberty ship program demonstrated otherwise. American workers voluntarily migrated across the country to take shipyard jobs. They bought war bonds, accepted rationing, worked overtime without compulsion. They did these things not because a dictator commanded it, but because the cause seemed worth the sacrifice. That willingness to mobilize without coercion proved more durable and more productive than systems built on fear and propaganda. When German factories relied increasingly on slave labor as the war progressed, productivity declined. Slaves sabotaged their work when possible. Free workers earning fair wages do not. The final Liberty ship, the SS Albert M. Bow, was launched in October 1945, 2 months after Japan's surrender. The program that had seemed impossible in 1941 had become routine by 1945. The shipyards that had employed hundreds of thousands of workers began shutting down, releasing their workforce back into a peacetime economy that would never quite return to pre-war patterns. The Liberty ships themselves had mixed fates. Many were sold off cheaply to commercial operators and served for decades in various merchant fleets. Some were scrapped, others were mothballed in reserve fleets anchored in rivers and bays across America, held against the possibility of future need. A handful survive today as museum ships, their welded hulls still intact, monuments to an industrial mobilization that changed the course of history. The German miscalculation about American industrial capacity was not merely a failure of intelligence or planning, it was a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that an enemy could operate on a scale that rendered traditional military calculus obsolete. When Dönitz calculated tonnage ratios, he was thinking in terms of limits: limited shipyard capacity, limited skilled labor, limited raw materials. These limitations were real for Germany, struggling under Allied bombing, deprived of resources from overseas, dependent on synthetic production for basic materials. But these limitations did not apply to America. The United States in 1943 was not operating at the limits of its capacity. It was operating at a fraction of its potential. The Liberty ship program could have been doubled, tripled even, if circumstances demanded it. The bottleneck was not production capability, but Atlantic convoy capacity to transport what was already being built. This asymmetry between Axis limitations and Allied abundance defined the war's outcome more than any single battle or campaign. The Wehrmacht could win. Tactical victories could destroy armies in the field, could hold defensive positions with skill and determination. None of it mattered against an enemy that could replace every loss, that could absorb defeats and return stronger, that possessed resources on a scale that made attrition warfare suicidal for the Axis. The Liberty ship was the maritime embodiment of this reality. Each one represented not just 10,800 tons of cargo capacity, but the industrial system that could produce such vessels in 6 weeks, that could build 2,110 of them in 4 years, that could do so while simultaneously producing millions of tons of armaments, vehicles, aircraft, and equipment. The Atlantic in 1945 bore little resemblance to the desperate battleground of 1942. Convoys crossed unmolested, their escorts occasionally detecting a U-boat contact, but more often making entirely uneventful passages. The sea lanes that had been graveyards were now highways. Liberty ships loaded in American ports crossed the Atlantic in massive convoys, unloaded in British or French harbors, and returned for another load. The system operated with the efficiency of a well-managed railway. German submariners still on patrol in those final months were hunting an enemy that no longer feared them, attacking supply lines that could absorb any losses they inflicted. The war at sea was over, decided not by a climactic battle, but by the slow, inexorable accumulation of industrial output that transformed strategic reality. In the vast silence of the Atlantic deep, the wrecks of U-boats and Liberty ships rest together, monuments to a conflict that tested the limits of industrial civilization. The submarines lie crumpled at depths where pressure crushed their pressure hulls, entombing crews who never escaped. The merchant ships rest scattered across the ocean floor, their cargo spilled across the seabed, tanks now encrusted with coral, trucks buried in silt, crates of supplies long since dissolved by seawater. Both sides fought with determination and courage. Both sides suffered catastrophic losses. But only one side possessed the industrial capacity to make those losses strategically meaningless. The Liberty ship was never intended to be remembered. It was designed to be functional, disposable, rapidly produced, and rapidly replaced if necessary. Yet it achieved what more celebrated vessels could not. It broke the back of the U-boat offensive simply by existing in numbers too vast to sink. The workers who built these ships returned to civilian life carrying skills and experiences that would reshape American society. The women who had welded Liberty ship hulls did not all return quietly to domestic life. Many remained in the workforce Having discovered capabilities and independence, they would not surrender easily. The black workers who had earned equal pay in the shipyards carried those expectations into the post-war economy, seeding civil rights demands that would transform America in subsequent decades. The industrial infrastructure built to produce Liberty ships, the shipyards, the steel mills, the transportation networks, remained in place, ready to support America's emergence as a global superpower. The war was an economic transformation, as much as a military one, accelerating changes that had been developing throughout the 1930s, proving that American industrial capacity, when fully mobilized, was without peer. The German commanders who had calculated tonnage ratios and predicted Allied collapse were not stupid or incompetent. They were working from assumptions that seemed reasonable based on historical precedent and their understanding of industrial limits. What they could not account for was an enemy operating on a different scale entirely, an economy so vast that it could simultaneously build ships, aircraft, tanks, and artillery in quantities that seemed to violate common sense. The Liberty ship was the physical proof of their miscalculation, a vessel built in weeks, produced by the thousands, carrying cargo that represented abundance on a scale the Axis could not match. Each Liberty ship that crossed the Atlantic was a mathematical statement. You cannot win this war. Your production cannot match ours. Your strategy is already obsolete. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was decided in Richmond, California, in Portland, Oregon, in Baltimore, Maryland, and in shipyards across America that most U-boat commanders never knew existed. It was decided by welders working night shifts, by crane operators lifting prefabricated sections, by logistics officers coordinating steel deliveries, by engineers simplifying designs, by workers who would never see combat but whose labor proved more decisive than any naval engagement. The Liberty ship was their weapon, crude and utilitarian, lacking grace but possessing the one quality that mattered most. It could be built faster than the enemy could destroy it. That simple fact, more than radar or sonar or code breaking or any tactical innovation, determined the war's outcome at sea. The Germans never knew the Liberty ship fleet was built faster than U-boats could sink them. By the time they understood, it was far too late to matter. The arithmetic had become inexorable. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The war would continue for 2 more years, consuming millions more lives, but the strategic equation had been solved. America's shipyards had forged victory one welded hull at a time, building not just vessels, but the material proof that democracy, when threatened, could mobilize industrial might that authoritarian regimes could not match. The Liberty ship was more than a transport. It was a declaration, welded in steel and launched into an ocean where numbers, not heroism, determined who would survive and who would drown in the relentless mathematics of total war.